Hello, I am Ghanwa Hakim, and you are watching The Arabic Hour. Today we bring you an interview with Dr. Edward Roger Owen discussing his latest book, The Rise and Fall of Arab Presidents for Life.
And I think one of the interesting things at the moment is that a lot of religious people thought the Arab Spring would be a pan-religious Islamic moment. I think it's a pan-Arab moment, but I think the people who thought it would be a pan-Islamic moment are to be disappointed, because you have the separate Islamic political things in each particular country.
Dr. Edward Roger Owen is a British historian who has authored several classic books on the history of the modern Middle East. His research interests include the economic, social, and political history of the Middle East, especially Egypt, from 1800 to the present, as well as the theories of imperialism, including military occupations. Owen is currently the A.J. Meyer Professor of Middle East History at Harvard University, and was previously the director of Harvard's Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Prior to teaching at Harvard, he was a faculty member at Oxford University, where he served several times as the director of the St. Antony's College Middle East Center. In addition to his teaching and scholarship, Owen frequently writes columns for the English-language versions of the Arabic newspapers Al-Hayat and Al-Ahram. His most recent book is The Rise and Fall of Arab Presidents for Life, published by Harvard University Press. And now, to Dr. Elaine Hagopian and her interview on the current political climate in the Arab world with our guest, Dr. Edward Roger Owen.
Thank you, Ghanwa, and we're happy today to welcome Roger Owen to Arabic Hour. Roger has written a most wonderful book. Anyone who wants to know why there were so many dictators for so long in the Arab world should read this book. It's called The Rise and Fall of Arab Presidents for Life. Roger, welcome to Arabic Hour.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if we could just have a little discussion about your book. You really spell out, I mean, it's a very concise, beautifully written book in which you talk about the post-colonial period and how the progression of the leadership went into this kind of dictatorship. And I wonder if you can share that with our audience.
Well, I think it has something to do with republics. I'm talking about the Arab republics,
yes,
of which most of them are in North Africa, as it turns out.
Yes.
5 in North Africa, then there are 2 in Yemen and Lebanon and in the East. So I was talking about presidents who came to power, or the succession of presidents who came to power in the colonial period, where you had a period of strong presidents, as you did have strong presidents around the non-European world, but then how they gradually became more and more monarchical, and then over time wanted their sons to succeed them. And I try and talk about that process and the kinds of cronyism and the kinds of wish for stability that led the presidents to want to establish monarchical, sort of quasi-monarchical regimes.
And they also started with a number of social welfare programs, in a sense, almost to co-opt their people. And then they moved into a neoliberal stage in which they needed money, and they began to cut those processes. So would you say that eventually this long procession of dictatorship leading into the neoliberal and creating this vast gap in the economy was the main reason for the Arab, quote-unquote, Arab Spring?
Well, it's one of the reasons. I think that the economic component was there, but I'm pretty sure that it's the dignity thing that was the most. People felt humiliated by being ruled, particularly by people like Gaddafi, being ruled by people they regarded as essentially idiotic clowns like Gaddafi, so that they didn't feel comfortable and proper. And everybody who talks about the Tahrir and so on say we feel free and we feel grown up again and we feel part of world history again. So I think that's it. But certainly I think the undermining of a welfare state which couldn't be afforded anymore and which was under attack from the IMF had something to do with it. And I think, in fact, what really happened was the loss of the Arab middle class, that they no longer saw the subsidies that they were there. They saw those subsidies being taken away. So I think that's the major economic component.
Comment a little bit, if you will, on the problem of the structure they entered into after the colonial period. Was there any option to this leadership in terms of really developing into a democratic society, or was the area so fractured and fragmented and artificial states, except for Egypt, that in a sense this almost was preordained?
Well, I talk about it in my book as a question of sovereignty and wishing to establish sovereignty, which meant, in the eyes of the first nationalist leaders, solidarity. You didn't want minorities, you didn't want divisions, you wanted to be able to patrol your own borders. So a strong presidency came about almost from the word go. There was a tiny democratic period. In Syria there were some elections, and as we know, in Egypt.
Until we had a coup there.
Yes, but
by the U.S.
But there was also, one of the feelings was that in defense of sovereignty, that the great powers would come back, as they obviously did, and try to overturn Nasser in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, or that there would be other internal assaults on their sovereignty. So there was a tendency to have strong leadership all over the place. But the leaders like Nasser, it never occurred to them to be succeeded by relatives or anything like that. Mm-hmm. They thought that there was the party or something or other would choose their successor.
And they built up their armies and security services. Mm-hmm. I mean, these were really institutionalized.
Yes.
So that in some ways, as you're getting into the Arab Spring, trying to change that, rather than have the new leadership enter into it and simply command it themselves, is a real challenge. I mean,
it certainly is. Yes, I mean, I think it was something to do with the state of Israel. So there was a feeling you had to have a big army. So that at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, that had something to do with it. But it is these competing intelligence services which we're now learning about, which actually was an extremely inefficient way of ruling, because they competed with each other and they told the leader what he wanted to hear and so on. There's a lot of new work of interviews of the people who remember the Nasser period and looking at political memoirs from that period.
Yes, and the important thing is that the army and the security services themselves took a big chunk of the economy. I mean, they benefited, and they have a vested interest in not seeing the kind of change that would alter their status. Could you tell us a little bit about the kind of deal you think Morsi made with the Egyptian army, having gotten rid of the two top leaders and putting them sort of back in the barracks? They're still there, they're still strong, they're still paid by the U.S. Are they there as sort of at the wish of the U.S. in case there is a problem, and allowing Morsi to be an upfront president? What kind of deal did he make with them?
Well, that's an interesting case, and we're talking just about Egypt. We're not talking about Tunisia, where the army is quite small. No, I think it suited everybody to have a large army that couldn't actually fight, but was in receipt of large quantities of American weapons which it couldn't use.
Yes.
So that was the deal, I think, and that's pretty clear that it suited the Israelis to have an army that couldn't fight. It suited the Americans. But the problem with the Egyptian army, I think, over time, was that it became so clumsy and so badly organized, it couldn't even do military maneuvers with the United States. Yeah. So it was a bit of an embarrassment. So I think that's part of it, that the army is there in Egypt, but there are a lot of dirty secrets. And I think Morsi probably just did a deal in which I went, you can get on with doing what you want to do, and provided you don't have a coup or anything.
Right, and the U.S. still provides $1.3 billion to the Egyptian army.
Yes.
Well, what do you, in a quick overview, because we'll come back to this, having these dictators now being challenged, what do you see as happening? Because the Muslim Brothers are now taking over. They never really went away. The debate that existed, decades ago and even a century ago, between Muslims about what kind of society they wanted once the West had challenged them, but Arab nationalism, secular nationalism, won out. But that debate was never finished, and the Muslim Brothers and other Islamic groups, the Selfies, sat in the background, and now they seem to be the dominant groups, having the secularists having been destroyed, except for Syria at the moment, and that's in the process of being destroyed.
Well, that's an interesting story, and I don't find it well understood in the United States and outside. That why after having a revolution, and we call it, I mean, I think we have to call it a revolution, and is that you have to have a new constitutional structure, and you also, the people have to be part of the new constitutional structure, because it is we the people. That's how the Egyptian constitution begins, as opposed, just like the American. So how do you get the people involved, plus the fact that once the people elect representatives, in the first phase they're bound to elect religious representatives, because as we know the religious parties are best organized, they're not corrupt, they were seen as victims under the dictatorship. So you have a period, you have a very messy period, which you can see in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya at the moment, where you try and have a new constitution. Lots of people appear and talk about identity and all kinds of things, and the Sharia at that stage. And then you get a new constitution, which people may or may not like, and then you have to face hideous economic problems after that. So that's why the revolution is incomplete, as it were, and there are such, Egyptians are reduced to sadness because they don't actually, it's so confused, they don't know what's going on at the moment.
It obviously, I mean, in Egypt, that there is a challenge to Morsi, but it's not an organized, it's not as well unified. And Morsi, on the other hand, is caught between these powers of the Muslim Brothers. The Constitution is seen by some as being too Islamic, by others as saying it's democratic. And we'll get to Egypt in a moment, but let me go on and talk a little bit about these Muslim Brothers and Selfies, and not all of whom are jihadists, but they form, the jihadists come out of them. And the Al-Qaeda, we have Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Syria, Al-Qaeda in the Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. Barack Obama told us that Al-Qaeda was, in a sense, decapitated and almost dead after Osama bin Laden was assassinated. But we see that in Yemen they are still kidnapping and doing their work, and even saying they will pay for someone to assassinate the American ambassador. They are operative in North Africa and in Mali and Nigeria. In Syria, they are well organized. Not only the Muslim Brothers, but the Jabhat al-Nusra, which we have declared as a terrorist group, but which Syrian rebels and the Syrian coalition we helped formed in Doha resent this. So tell us about the Muslim Brothers and how they're differentiated from the Al-Qaeda, jihadist, Salafi groups, and what is going to be the dynamic between these, because they are present in Egypt, now that there's a government, and they are certainly striving to control Syria.
Well, needless to say, it is extremely complicated, and people are identified with political Islam for any number of reasons, including, I think, in Egypt, people who just would be called traditionalists, in the sense that they see the religious people as more connected with a tradition, and they're tired of all the comings and goings and ups and downs. So, but once the religious people get in power, they are aware that they're not very good at managing the economy. They split. The Muslim Brothers can't maintain its top-down authority in Egypt anymore, and so there are all kinds of challenges and rooms for smaller groups to come in, which include the Salafis and so on, with different versions of how society ought to be organized. And I think on the whole this is quite healthy. You have to have, if you're in a Muslim country, Islam has to find a place in the identity and the practice of the people.
I think that's what has been denied so long.
And they're catching up with a debate that should have been going on for a very long time. Luckily, with leaders who in prison or in exile, like Rashid Ghanouchi, had time to think about how they should adjust, and they have this new notion of democracy that in an Islamic society the representatives of the people are also the representatives of Islam, and that's the formula they're trying to work with.
But differentiate for us the Muslim Brothers who now control Egypt, and in Syria, they compose the major rebel force, but it is the Al-Qaeda and jihadist groups that seem to be the better organized and now have taken over Yarmouk, which was a Palestinian area, not exclusively in Damascus. What is the difference between the Muslim Brothers? And the Muslim Brothers in Syria are different from those in Egypt, even though they're offshoots. Tell us your views on these.
Well, I think the Salafi groups are easier to understand, and they, on the whole, are not necessarily committed to violence, but they are national. So the Egyptian Salafis are different from the Libyan Salafis, and they are playing politics in of course, a rather rough and extreme way within their own countries. I mean, Qaeda is something quite different, and that's using the Middle East to get at the United States and drawing on extraordinary skills that they've developed in Afghanistan, beginning in Afghanistan.
Yes.
So you can see in Syria they're extremely good at blowing up things, and they're fearless and so on. So they are extreme fighters, and that, I think, is what everybody's worried about. That if they were to somehow come to power after the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, I don't think that's going to happen for a moment, because they're not organized on a popular political basis.
No, they're not. But where they are rather strong, and they're a force, whether they're in.
Well, I would say strong in the sense that they're very good at killing people and blowing things up. I don't know.
Yes.
That doesn't translate into political act. They can
they're
destabilize.
They're considered to be better organized than the other rebel groups. I mean, in Syria. For example.
Yes. But if you look at them in a large North African country, for example, their chances of winning over more than a very small number of people to their cause are remote in the extreme. And they're isolated by the Azhar and traditional religious people too.
So we would say the Salafis, who may, not all of them of course, are jihadists, are more nationalists.
Yes.
That they are interested in their country and want very much to see it more Islamic and run in a different way.
Right. I mean, that is a political program.
And the Al-Qaeda group is more interested in knocking off a lot of people, as well as the idea of reconstructing some form of Islamic Ummah, the larger unit. That's their idea. It doesn't mean they're going to get there, but would that be how you would differentiate them?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the Osama bin Laden franchise, as we know about, you can create small groups within his name, and you get a lot of disaffected youths who feel that Islam is in danger, and that's a completely different pan-Islamic program. And I think one of the interesting things at the moment is that a lot of religious people thought the Arab Spring would be a pan-religious Islamic moment. I think it's a pan-Arab moment, but I think the people who thought it would be a pan-Islamic moment are to be disappointed, because you have the separate Islamic political things in each particular country.
There are many writers who were disappointed in the death of secularism in the area, and in fact saw in the sort of reemergence of the Muslim Brothers the idea of, really, this is Arab nationalism with an Islamic face. And it's not so much an Islamic unity so much as it's Arab nationalism. I mean, that's what they see it as, the new form of a kind of Arabism.
Yes, they didn't read the books on the Muslim Brothers by Richard Mitchell and so on.
No.
And the last Hassan al-Banna was an Egyptian nationalist, and he wanted a place within Egyptian politics. And though he would send a few volunteers off to help the Palestinians, you know, their 20s, 30s, 40s. The Arabism and Islam is only a small part of the Egyptian identity. It's Egypt, Egypt, Egypt.
Now, would you say the difference between the Salafis, leave Al-Qaeda to the side, the Salafis and the Muslim Brothers, is that the Salafis want more Islamic content in the Constitution and the running of society than the Muslim Brothers?
Well, I think the Muslim Brothers is a huge organization.
Yes,
it's millions and millions of people, so it shades in. And I think what has happened in Egyptian history, and no doubt in where the Muslim Brothers have always been the strongest, that you start by joining the brothers, and then within the brothers there's a kind of sorting out process. and then you got in the old days some kind of secret organization or something rather of tough guys, and that happens. So I think almost everybody starts in the Muslim Brothers, and then they find something else, and a preacher in a particular mosque appears and preaches a particular a harder version of Islam, and they follow him, and he has a small following. But I think that they're only tiny in terms of popular support and votes and so on. There are
really no clear-cut divisions between Muslim Brothers and the Selfies. It's sort of a gradation.
Yes. And I don't know anybody who's done a good job of trying to sort that out, and I think it is probably highly situational and contextual. That it depends on what the question is and what is going on, and if there's electoral politics, or if it's Mubarak, then can't be electoral politics, so you have to have underground politics.
Well, it's still, I think this Islamic factor has not fully been understood as part of what's happening in the Middle East, and that it really is the reemergence of something that had been almost suppressed for years. Seymour Hersh wrote an interesting article in 2007 in the New Yorker called The Redirection. It was during the Bush administration, in which the redirection was almost a kind of contradiction to American policy, that they were now going to be supporting Saudi Arabia to support some of these more fundamentalist jihadists, be they Selfies, not Al-Qaeda, but Selfies mostly, the more militant types rather than the intellectual. And he pointed out that it was Cheney and Elliott Abrams who concocted this, the old neocons, and it became a Bush administration policy since Iraq wasn't going as well as they had hoped. Their concern was that while the Sunnis were fighting against America in Iraq, they were more concerned about the fact that the larger Shiite population of Iraq had now become much more involved with Iran. And traditionally the U.S. is frightened of Iran, Syria, Hezbollah alliance, and now you have southern Iraq. So they played with fire by finally joining Saudi Arabia, who has a Sunni, very fundamentalist country, concerned about Shiism of Iran, concerned about the fact that they have a Shiite population adjacent to Iran, and in a sense gave a go-ahead sign, and Qatar joined in, and Qatar supports the Muslim Brothers, and we know its role in Libya, etc. So have you sensed American, I mean, Obama obviously continued this policy after he made a speech in Cairo and diplomacy didn't work out. Is there an unease about this policy? Because it seems to be in process. And we have given Saudi Arabia sort of, carte blanche in some ways and restricted them in other ways to support these people. Now Saudi Arabia is concerned about that support.
Well, it depends where you mean where is an unease. I mean, you and I probably feel an unease because it's a completely idiotic version of, and happily can't work because the crudity of the division of the Middle East into Sunnis and Shias and so on, and pro this and pro that. So I think if there was one thing to be gained in the Obama first administration was that he at least seemed to recognize the limits of American power, and that you had to work with what you had, and you settled down to working with friendly kinds of people from an American point of view, like the Saudis and the Qataris. Now I think with the second Obama administration, with people like Hagel and so on around the place, I feel much more comfortable about that. They're not anti-Shi'i warriors or anything of that kind, and they have a much better sense of the limitations of American power and what you have to do to be constructive in the Middle East rather than constantly seeing enemies under the bed.
I mean, my sense is that Obama is actually uncomfortable with the present policies and the Israeli pressure constantly to do this and to do that. And you can see from the pressure coming from the pro-Israeli lobby that Hagel is unacceptable to them, though he's pro-Israeli, but not the pro-militant kind. So that the whole Islamophobia around which the Israeli policies have been built is being, in a sense, challenged. And how is this going to complicate American foreign policy?
Well, I think that the two good things, as I tried to say, which I think is that one of there are limits of American power,
yes,
which may also be connected with the tilt. So if there is American power, it's going to have to be exercised in the China Sea or somewhere other, and not in the Middle East.
The Pacific, right.
And the other kind of thing is that I think that everybody knows that attacking Iran would be a terrible mistake. So that you have to have this is Obama's. You have to negotiate with the Iranians in some kind of way and wait for that moment when the people in Tehran will be more acceptable to that, and that seems to be working. The stresses and strains in Iran, as we know, due to the sanctions and so on. So I feel quite comfortable about that, but I think the limits of American power, that's extremely important.
It is indeed, and as one commentator put it, the U.S., Barack Obama especially, is giving Israel sort of all the good things that it wants, more aid, more missiles, more this, more that, short of agreeing to war. And the Israelis, I mean, Netanyahu knows that. And that's what bothers him. And so Hagel coming in would just verify it even more. And I don't know what this means in terms of Israeli relationships, say, with Egypt and other areas, or whether the U.S. is trying to orchestrate that. Do you have any sense of that relationship of Israel and Egypt? Very important relationship.
Well, I mean, if you localize it, I think Rafah, the crossing point where Egypt and Israel and the Gaza Strip meet, is obviously one of the world's flashpoints. So I think the American interest in Egypt at the moment is just making sure that nothing gets out of hand, and either lots of Palestinians don't rush out of Gaza into Egypt, or lots of Egyptians don't rush into Gaza, or something of that kind. That's a kind of holding operation. But I think when you have the likes of Thomas Friedman and so on warning the Israelis that they've lost, there's a bit of mileage in that.
Yes.
Because I think the next Israeli government, there will be enormous pressure to stop calling the settlements. And there is this desire to have an Israeli university on the West Bank and so on, which is now countered by the fact that Palestinian statehood is accepted at the UN, and the Palestinians at least have some card. They are recognized by most of the world as an occupied country. So it's a very interesting moment, and it's difficult. But I think that there is change there.
There's a lot of change there, considering that there was such a stalemate before. And while Netanyahu keeps saying he's not worried about the state, it's just change of name. In fact, they expended a lot of energy and money trying to block that that vote. I'll come back to that. I would like to just stay with Egypt for a bit, and then I would like for us to go into the Gulf area and cover some of the countries like Yemen and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and so forth. And Kuwait, interesting things are happening in Kuwait. But first, there's been recent studies now, or articles, on Egypt, and that while Morsi is playing this game of trying to reinstate Egypt as a major power, which is important because it's more of a stabilizing factor if you have a decent Egypt. Nonetheless, the Muslim Brothers not only had an impact on the Constitution, which annoyed the secularists, but it seems that there is now more and more effort to, as one put it, to Muslim brotherhoodize labor, certain government offices, and that this makes them people more worried. But the most important point is that the Muslim Brothers, as with their impact on Morsi, are simply taking over what Mubarak had, and rather than changing it, are trying to control it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that may well be, although it's extremely difficult to know. I mean, my own feeling is that Morsi had quite a good hand to play. He's shown much less skill at leading Egypt than many of us imagined. He's created a lot of problems for himself. And we shall see when the next elections come that it's very clear that Muslim Brother support will be down, and that the non-Muslim politicians will have got their act together a bit, and the women and the liberals and so on, and that this will put a constraint on Muslim Brother activity. So I'm reasonably sanguine about that. I mean, the unfortunate thing is that Egypt is now hideously divided, which has never happened before in my life.
No.
That Egyptians don't talk to each other, they just shout at each other. But they know too that that's not how Egypt should do things, and that nobody will...
I mean, Egypt really, when you look at the Arab world, Egypt is the really only nation. All the others seem to be tribes with flags, as one person called it. Some have some integrity, but Egypt really has a kind of solid historical. So it is kind of hard to see. It's painful to see this kind of yelling that's going on now.
I mean, I think it's much better to think of Egypt as a Maghrebi country. So, as it were, the Maghreb states are states and nations, with the possible exception of Libya, which never quite became a nation. So when we talk about the Middle East and say many of the things about the Middle East, we are in fact only talking about east of Suez.
Yeah,
we're talking about what used to be Greater Syria, and we're talking about Iraq, the Fertile Crescent. So that is in a state of considerable confusion, and has been since, you could say, the Mandate times.
I mean, most of the Arab states and Arab people are in North Africa.
Yes.
And people don't realize that. They always think of Syria and Lebanon and so forth.
I mean, one of the interesting things about the Spring is that the Arab world is united in a sense, because the Spring began in North Africa.
Yes.
You can't talk about the Middle East and North Africa, as people in America used to do, as separate things. They belong together, but different things are happening in different places.
What's always been interesting to me is that it's always been very difficult in the United States to find a map that included North Africa and the Middle East as one unit.
Yes.
I mean, the Arab region, and it was always by map, splitting the region and creating this kind of thing. Let's creating this kind of idea of fragmentation.
You have been watching an interview with Dr. Edward Roger Owen discussing the current political climate in the Arab world. Please stay with us for more after this short break.
You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Let's talk about the other Gulf states and go through them and where they fit into the Arab Spring, always in quotes, because we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but it'll never be like it was, that's for sure. So let's start with Yemen. And tell us, you know, or whatever order you would like to take them in. I mean, I have all the Gulf countries, and give us a little capsule of what you're thinking about these countries and what their role is. And how they're faring.
Well, I think Yemen is a country is a kind of tribal place, I think, a bit like Sudan, where because of its mountains and its size and its tribal history, the best you can do is to manage it and keep it under some sort of control. And I think that's why Ali Abdullah Saleh was allowed to go back, because
they need him.
He had that skill brought up of, you know, you have to have a tremendous memory, and you have to know which tribe did which, and who to give three rifles to, and all that kind of thing. But on the other hand, Yemen is also an increasingly urban population, with a increasing population of university educated and so you have the Arab Spring is reflected, as we know, in the young people of Lebanon who camped out near the university in Sana'a and so on. So that seems to be in a state of uncertainty. But I think what helps is that they have a tradition of having elections,
Yes.
in Yemen, which provides some outlet for politics, and so it isn't just street politics, it's also electoral politics.
The present leader of Yemen is considered to be very pro-Western. He's not always very popular with some of his people. I don't know what that means, because whenever you want to put someone aside or criticize them, you can just say they're pro-West or they're pro-Al-Qaeda or whatever. What are your thoughts on the new leader?
You mean Al-Hayat al-Saleh?
Yes. No, the new leader, Hadi.
I imagine he's pretty much like the old leader, in the sense that the constraints in Yemen are quite extraordinary, and not only do you have the fact that you have Qaeda there and you rely on the United States for military.
He came out with a statement where he favored the drones.
Yes.
And that alienated some of the...
But if you think of water resources and so on, although I'm very glad snow came to Jerusalem the other day.
Yes.
So that's a bit of water. But in fact, Yemen is in terms of physical resources, in such terrible shape. I mean, it's a bit like Egypt, I think, or some other places where people think the political problems are so time-consuming, but actually the physical problems of the Nile, of salination, and so on, which need to be addressed with a plan that goes into the 40 or 50 years, are far, in the end, more debilitating. And I think that's the same in Yemen, and that the water problem is just quite extraordinary.
Let me just dwell on Yemen a little bit, because it is very important. I mean, the Al-Qaeda is operative there, but it is a tribal area, and Saleh used to manage them, co-opt this one, and so forth. And you're saying that this guy has to learn how to do that. Can it ever be a federated state having more order rather than managing these people? Because they cannot really collect taxes. I mean, their sources of revenue are practically nil, because it is so unruly. And they did have some oil, but I mean, their resources are very skimpy.
I think we have to recognize the limits of government. I mean, Afghanistan went completely wrong when a group of Marxish students took over in the 1970s and tried to have women's rights and land reform and so on, and just stirred up everybody. And then the Russians came to help them, and we know, and then the Russians disappeared. And so there are certain countries where I think you just have to recognize the terrain and the tribal character, and you have to accept a different style of management until the moment comes when sufficient number of people, I suppose, are educated and what might be called modern or something, where you can contemplate the state. Actually
break that structure and change it.
I mean, that's what's interesting with the Karzai visit. There's the extent to which the United States knows how to manage Afghanistan, and the extent to which it's slipping back into what it was in the British days in India, where the ruler controls 50 miles around Kabul, and the rest is the local guys collecting taxes and growing opium and doing all the other kinds of things which they will continue to do.
What I see as the greatest challenge, not only in Yemen but really in this whole Arab Spring, is breaking the institutions that were there that actually bolstered the dictators. And they're still there when you go in. The army, the security forces, the way the economy is run, and so forth.
But the point about Saleh is, in those countries they can't be dictatorships.
No,
that's your point. Karzai and Al-Saleh, and to an extent the ruler of Sudan can't, because of the nature of the countryside and the nature of history and so on.
And they have to continue, but I mean, in places like Egypt or Syria and so forth, that that would be a real challenge. Now let's talk about Bahrain, because here we have an emir that became a king and rules over a little teeny island where the fifth our bases are. Yes. We have a naval base there. What is happening now in Bahrain? Because you have a Sunni government, which is 30% of the population, and then you have the Shiites, and you have a lot of expatriates. Is it really a sectarian fight, or is it really just a fight for being included?
As far as the Shias are concerned, the majority.
Yes.
Well, I think they feel that in a representative democracy that the majority must win, and they see. I mean, I think the thing about one of the only hopeful things about Bahrain is that everybody is committed to Bahrain and finding a solution. And I think the trouble is with the Khalifas, the ruling family, which some of them are sensible and understand what needs to be done, and the others are hardliners, and they've had a tradition, which I'm afraid goes back to the British, of whacking people and torturing them and putting them down. So it's, in the end it'll have to sort out, but it's very sad to see all the bloodshed and problems that will exist until the next generation of the younger Khalifas come in and practice and get rid of that head of the police and all that kind of thing.
What puzzles me is we have our Fifth Fleet there. And the Saudis actually went in at one time to put down the majority rebellion, and we did nothing. And so obviously we continue to support this minority government, and even though we talk about inclusiveness and human rights and so forth, this makes it more difficult, even though the King Khalifa may be bending towards doing something. There is a continuous pressure that somehow Bahrain, because it has a large Shiite population, will become too much a part of the orbit of Iran. Is there any truth to that?
I honestly don't know. I mean, Washington is not one of my areas of expertise. It's too puzzling for me. But I mean, it does seem to me that bases are movable and so on. So if the base is not movable, it's because the Navy wants there to be a base there, and that's where you start. That's where you start from. Yes. So once you have a base there, then your options are limited.
And the other thing is, of course, Bahrain took over all the banking when Lebanon was in its civil war, so it has major communication and banking commercial activities. It's this little teeny island.
Yes. Well, I think they were very clever about that.
Yes.
I mean, they found an in because they did all kinds of financial services for the Saudis, which the Saudis couldn't do themselves because of their belief about interest and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
So but the Bahrainis are challenged by the Dubai people, and there's great competition in the Gulf and the Kuwaitis. So they don't have that particular advantage.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia and the others. Saudi Arabia has been supporting the jihadists. I mean, they have been paying them. They pay the Salafi jihadists in, they pay the Salafis in, whether jihadists or not, in Egypt. They have certainly been supporting the jihadists in Syria. There was a recent article in which they're saying even Saudi Arabia is beginning to get concerned about some of the jihadists that might have an impact even on Saudi Arabia itself. Where is Saudi Arabia in all of this? I mean, it seems funny when the U.S. is frightened of the jihadists like the Nusra group, Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, might put them on the terrorist group, and yet they're paid by Saudi Arabia. They are welcomed by the new Syrian coalition that was formed in Doha under American auspices. The Muslim Brother rebels want them to be recognized because they're more efficient, and they number only about 5,000 in Syria. So where is Saudi Arabia on this now? Is it getting worried about the support they're giving to these people? Or?
I don't think you can talk about Saudi Arabia as though it was a coherent enterprise. It consists of a lot of very old men with different views about, I mean, they're united in trying to make sure the family survives. But
yes,
they have
the only country I think that has is named after their family.
Yes, so they have that. I think they have different policies, and we try and say this person is moderate and this isn't. But they run their own little empires, and there is the army, but then there are various other groups, and also they're not. The administration is hopelessly inefficient. It doesn't do the things that administrations do, like paperwork and coordination. So they rely on, insofar as some of them have a foreign policy, they have to rely on other guys to do the stuff for them. And I think that explains why some of the princes support Salafi people or other people.
So it would not necessarily be a central government decision, but a whole bunch of these princes who are paying people for their own purposes.
That's how I would look at Saudi Arabia. It's very, yes. I mean, it's functional in the sense that it keeps going, but dysfunctional in the sense that it can't do anything other than keep going.
It has had uprisings as well.
Yes,
and how long can it tolerate this? I mean, they can only cut off so many hands and kill so many people, especially in that oil area that faces Iran, where you have a Shiite Saudi population. How long can the government continue to deal with this and not have it affect its own status?
Well, we know that there have been uprisings, and there was Juhayman and the mosque and so on, and I think that they benefit just from the kind of enforced apathy of the Saudi people, who don't see any point in doing anything, are reasonably comfortable and well off, can go to America when they feel like it and so on. So I don't think there's any particular popular pressure. I think it's the king and some sensible advisors at the moment anticipating the way things are going, allowing women, today's thing about allowing women into the Shura Council.
There have been some groups that have presented reform ideas to the government, and the government always said it's entertaining them but never does. There's an exile fellow, Ali Ahmed, in Washington, who used to call himself as the promoter of Saudi human rights, and suddenly he's tried to look a little fancier and doesn't mention Saudi Arabia as much, but is working with the Zionist organizations in Washington. I find that whole exile group in Washington for the different states fascinating, and I'm never sure if one can learn about American foreign policy by looking at them or trying to look at the country. But
I mean, I think one thing has happened as a result of the spring is that the human rights agenda cannot be denied.
That's right.
And this is one of the languages you talk. And unless you do something, you can't just get away with saying we have a few token women or whatever we're doing, or you can visit our prisons every now and again. You have, I think,
you have to actually do something.
You actually have to do something, and that will work its way even in through places like Saudi Arabia.
We have some time left, not a lot, but let us go on to Qatar. Qatar is very interesting in that here is this very small state, and mostly it's filled with expatriates. It should have a minority problem, but I guess they pay very well. And they have CENTCOM is stationed there, American CENTCOM for that whole area. They seem to have been giving money to Libyan Muslim Brothers and Tunisia. In Egypt, they're now giving piles of money. What is their role? Are they just wanting to be an actor in a country that has 230,000 Qatari Arabs? What is their role? I mean, they have tons of money, but
they don't know what their role is. Basically, the family is divided, and so and then they have every now and again they have moments of great uncertainty. 4 or 5 years ago, when they feel that they're overstretched and they're too open to criticism because they take too high-profile things. They're back in business, trying to be good guys and inviting everybody to Qatar at the moment, and
they're inviting the Kurds to come.
Yes, they want to solve problems, and then something will go wrong in the next few years, and then they'll retreat a bit. But whoever is actually calling the shots in the ruling family in Qatar at the moment they are the outward-looking people, but I'm sure there's some inward-looking people and say, well, it's dangerous. We could be swept off the map in no time at all if people turn against us.
What about Al Jazeera? I mean, the government basically funds Al Jazeera, and there was an uproar over Syria, that it wasn't covering Syria fairly, that it had now begun to play politics and that where Al Jazeera used to be very popular, that there was concern about this, and several people quit over the coverage on Syria. What are your thoughts on Al Jazeera?
Well, I think it's a wonderful organization, and I think its role in the uprising, and particularly in Tunisia, where they were all over the place and you could see it, and Tahrir and so on, was just terrific. But again, they are subject to disputes and differences of opinion within the family in Qatar, and obviously somebody has said that they should be more careful, and so there are signs of censorship at the moment. But that could be reversed. I mean, nothing is irreversible.
No, I mean, they've been better on Syria more recently, but I mean, they support the Muslim Brothers in Syria.
But they're also they can easily be subject to blackmail. I mean, everybody knows that that some Gulf states pay money to the Qaeda people and so on.
To not cover them in certain ways.
Well, or not to come and blow them up or something or other. So I think there's also probably some of that is probably going on too.
We have about 1 minute. Can we tell us a little something about Oman, which is both different in terms of its Islamic content and you have Sultan Qaboos there. So can you tell us something about Oman, which is an important country?
Yes. Well, I think it's a one-man show, and I think he's shown quite good skills, managerial skills. His problem is he doesn't have a son, as you know, so nobody knows what's going to happen next, so there's a certain degree of uncertainty. But he seems to have integrated the bits of the country together rather well, and I think the British overthrew his father, and whom it appears he never talked to and didn't particularly like, but I think in that sense he's quite a good choice. I think we're back with the Yemen situation or the Sudanese situation or the Afghan situation, that it's you want a managerial person in charge who can keep things going, and I think up to a point in terms of tourism and in terms of the university, he's actually doing quite well.
Well, I want to close by reminding people of your book, and also we didn't discuss Morocco and Jordan, which you discuss here as that they don't have as great a problem of legitimacy because of, and especially Morocco, which has a long history of Sultan and its relationship to the Prophet. So that'll be for another time. I want to thank you for being on Arabic Hour, and I hope you'll come back and join us again sometime.
I'd like that. Thank you.
You have been watching an interview with Dr. Edward Roger Owen, discussing the current political climate in the Arab world. Dr. Owen is a British historian who has authored several books on the history of the modern Middle East, his latest entitled The Rise and Fall of Arab Presidents for Life.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Thank you so much for joining us. Some stations will be leaving us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you staying with us for the remainder of the hour, we hope you enjoy the last musical segment following the closing credits. On behalf of the volunteer staff here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghanwa Hakim, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdullah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience. The American Arabic Benevolent Association, ABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors. The Nicholas G. Barham Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride. And by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.
بيناتنا يلول ويموت فوق السهل لون الليلة يروح ويجي بيناتنا يلول ويموت فوق السهل لون الليلة وما حدا يسأل شو باك وشو بدي وما حدا يسأل شو باك وشو بدي وقلت بكتب لك بكتب لك بكتب لك بكتب لك هيك كانوا يعملوا العشاق وينك تركت القلب